Hello, everybody. Welcome to the intelligence lecture part two of two. Now, we have discussed theories of intelligence, and we're moving on to intelligence tests and also the heritability or the environmental causes of IQ scores, um, and to a certain degree, intelligence. So, for today's assignment, what you're going to need to do is look at this particular worksheet that I should have handed you in class. As you watch the video, take notes on what's being said. And then finally, at the backside, there's a question here about how you might improve IQ tests to become more accurately measure intelligence or be less culturally biased. Now, just write your 2 or 3 suggestions. You might want to consider the theories from the last lecture. You can also find that information on page 321 and 322. But bottom line, write 2 or 3 suggestions of what you think would honestly improve intelligence tests. Feel free to get creative here. I would love to hear your input. So let's get into the lecture. Let me try and keep it brief as possible. So let's get in present mode. All right. Let me provide you with a little historical context. Intelligence tests are roughly about 110, 115 years old. And the reason they were developed was because in France, there were students in school that were not doing well. And the education ministry in France asked Alfred Binet, a famous psychologist at the time, that's why we have the Binet in Stanford Binet Intelligence Test, asked him to develop a test to identify these people. He did, and they used that information to identify the people who needed special help or more assistance. So that's the origin of intelligence tests, to identify those who not are gifted but have intellectual disabilities. IQ stands for intelligence quotient because it's as a result of division. And at the time, it was a comparison between mental age and chronological age, which was multiplied by 100. So if you're 10 years old and you have a mental age of 15, then do the math and you get a IQ of 150. That means you're gifted, very intelligent. The problem with this is this math doesn't work after the age of 16. And so they had to change things up to the deviation IQ scores. So this is where standardization comes in, like I talked about last time. And it's assumed that people generally have a IQ score of about 100 with a standard deviation of 15. Today we use the Stanford Binet Intelligence Test. Different from 110 years ago, but we still use it. We also use the Wechsler Intelligence Tests. And this particular test yields a verbal and performance score, as well as an overall score for intelligence. So here are some sample items. Feel free to pause at any time and take a look at these if you're interested. This is just for your own information. I definitely won't test you on this stuff. Same thing here. This is for the Wechsler Intelligence Test for adults. As you can see, it tests many different verbal and performance abilities. It's still definitely not a comprehensive test, but it's the one that is used today. Now, just because we have those two forms of intelligence tests doesn't mean that people aren't, and psychologists are not, developing new intelligence tests. What we really want to see out of any test, in particular intelligence test, is that it's valid and it's reliable. We want to make sure that it actually tests what it tests, and that it reliably gives us a particular score. So, for example, let's say we measure intelligence as how often you go to school, your attendance. Well, attendance is not really related to intelligence, so that would not be a valid intelligence test. Or if I took a intelligence test and the first time I got 150, and the second time I got 90, and then the third time I got 250, which was Einstein's score, by the way, that would not be very reliable. We could not trust any of the numbers that come out of that test. So ideally, we want an intelligence test that is both valid and reliable. And the current IQ tests that we have are, which include the SAT and the ACT to some extent, are good and reliable insofar as they predict academic success in college, especially the first year of university. Um, there's a lot of students that drop out of college and quit the first year, and so higher scores tend to predict more success and less likely to drop out. Therefore, the higher score means that a university is not wasting its time by admitting you into its college if you have a high SAT score or high IQ score. Now, let's get into heredity, heritability, and the environment and intelligence. I caution you before I get into this that a lot of these studies are based on IQ scores. And now there's a lot of arguments that IQ doesn't actually measure intelligence. And to a certain degree, it does, but obviously it's not perfect. So I have to insist that there's a difference between having a high IQ and being intelligent, and they're not always the same. So that being said, let's get into cultural bias. Um, so generally, we have found historically that many intelligence tests have been developed, and generally they show cultural bias from the culture it was made in. So, for example, if you took an intelligence test in the United States and in Japan, for example, you would get different results because both cultures value different things about intelligence. So, Americans might appreciate or value analytical intelligence, whereas the Japanese may value practical intelligence more than analytical. So, naturally, you're going to get a different score if it's measuring a different type of intelligence. Now, and psychologists have tried to develop universally true, culturally bias free tests, but it's been shown to be virtually impossible. And the best thing you can do is produce a intelligence test that is minimally culturally biased. We're talking about minimum, trying to eliminate as much as you can. It's impossible to eliminate all of it. Um, Also, there have been some messed up uses of IQ tests in the past. For example, IQ tests have been used in immigration, which is not great because sometimes immigrants will come to the United States and not speak English, fail the IQ test, and be deported back to their country. Um, Also, this has been used for soldiers. This has been used in a lot of other areas, sometimes appropriate, sometimes not. Um, and just know um, that the IQ score is just a number to a certain extent. It's just a number. So, it has been found that there's a strong correlation between IQ scores of people that are very genetically related. So, for example, identical twins have a high degree of relatedness in their IQ scores. And based on those genetic studies, we have found that it's estimated that 50% of your IQ comes from your DNA, from your parents, and about the other 50 comes from your environment. Um, so to illustrate the point, it's been found that identical twins that were raised together, and again, identical twins have identical 100% the same DNA, their IQ scores are very related. Now, if that score was 1, that would mean both their IQ scores were caused only by DNA, but that's not true. We see a 15% lack here. So the difference in their IQ score, that 15% is the differences in their environment. And you have to understand that even though they're genetically identical twins often have very different personality traits and get treated differently as a result by people in their environment. You'll also notice that identical twins that were raised apart in different households. These are identical twins that were given up for adoption at birth and separated into different homes. There's even more environmental influence. So about 40% of their IQ comes from the environment, and about 60% is attributed to their DNA. And you see this exact same pattern in biological siblings, biological children and parents, and unrelated individuals together and apart. This illustrates the point that um, environment is very important. And even more to the point, um, when we look at differences in IQ scores between whites and Asians, for example, between them and Black and Latino populations, the difference in the IQ score is not genetic; um, it is environmental. The definition of intelligence is being able to learn from one's past, acquire knowledge, and use resources to find creative solutions, problem solve. Now, if you grow up in an environment in a low income neighborhood with an underfunded school, with busy working parents, you may be undernourished, underutilized. You might not have the resources to take SAT prep classes. You might not have the resources to participate in school events or school trips. So, a lot of differences in IQ scores, not necessarily intelligence, are due to where you grew up, your environment, and to some degree, your culture. So, for example, some people expect people of color to do poorly and for white people and Asian people to do well. And that's somehow related to their DNA, but it's not. Um, a lot of what happens is indifferential treatment. Prejudice and racism can cause these differences also. Hope you enjoyed the lecture. Please make sure you wrap up those notes and answer that last question, and I'll see you guys in class.